I'm Marc Morell. I'm a Majorcan social anthropologist who's been specialising his academic career in the class character of the production of space in capitalist society. I've been working for different institutions, universities, and until now my field research always happened in Mediterranean islands, Majorca and Malta, on topics linked to heritage and gentrification. I'm here in Lithuania due to two reasons. One of them is personal. I met a person from here, a friend, and I visited Vilnius quite a lot of times. The other reason, it's also personal, but it's got to do with work, is that since recently I'm contracted at Riga Strādiņa Universitāte in Riga, Latvia, and I've been commissioned to do field research in Vilnius and in Riga on the potential of the arts for the social transformation of the city. It's a new field for me. It's different from what I was doing before, but it's like joyful also within the point of my career to change location and to change topics too. Coming from the Mediterranean to the Baltic countries, at first, and in Vilnius, which was the first site I landed to, I was always like flipped. I always saw it as very exotic, and I saw it exotic for the layout of the city, for the history of the country, and also for how people are. People are different in many ways as people are in the Mediterranean too, and also how society is organized. One of the things that I was very curious about was if there were any strong social movements in Lithuania and now in Latvia with the research I'm doing, as strong as the ones we would find in the Spanish state where I originally come from. And this is one of the reasons why I chose actually to look at the arts, because also I realized that in Vilnius, and I'm realizing now in Riga also, that there's a very high concentration of artists for the amount of population both countries have as compared to the Spanish state. That triggered a kind of logic in my head. I don't know if it's really logic, but a question. And the question was if within this massive amount of artists in both cities, there would actually be an art with a social or political content, which is what I normally would locate in my own country within the social movements I was mentioning before. Because of my job as an academic, I've got to read a lot. This has meant an important shift in my life. I was a person who, since a very early age, read a lot of novels of all kind. But my academic career has basically narrowed that down to academic texts. However, within my studies on heritage and gentrification in specific locations in the Mediterranean, I was always interested in framing those locations through the arts. Not only photography or film or even paintings, but also text, poetry and novels that spoke about the cities I was visiting and that made me understand also the historical roots that created those novels at a specific time. But it's also a pleasure and a joy to be able to read novels that are situated in cities. It makes me who I am in a way as an urban anthropologist. I had the opportunity to receive as presents two books that are based in Vilnius. The first one was Tula from Jurgis Kuncinas. It was very joyful to read, and we can go into more detail at one point. And the second one was Vilnius Poker of Ričardas Gavelis. And to tell the truth, these are the only books I have read of Lithuanian literature. So I would be an imposter if I come here presenting myself as a specialist. But they are interesting, and I think they're very related in many ways, both books. And both books also are an expression, I guess, of a time and of a society of that time too. While reading these books, I realized I could reflect upon them at different levels. The first one, it's the form, it's the text, the way these authors write. I'll always remember Cuncina's writing in I would call it almost like a circular manner that rolls and repeats itself and comes back and rolls throughout the whole novel, at least until the very end, where it changes drastically and it's got like a kind of different written style. Very long paragraphs, not a lot of commas and full stops, which made it for me difficult to be able to get into. However, after page 30, I guess I was already in the mood and taking it over. The writing style of Gavelis in Vilnius Pocket completely different, a lot more used to what I am. Both books completely relate. They're speaking about the last period of the Soviet occupation in Vilnius, in Lithuania, and Vilnius being the capital. And it's experienced in very traumatic ways, as it was also, and I think both authors convey this trauma. But at the same time, both books share, I don't know, is it a coincidence that these two books landed in my hands? But both books lead with another kind of trauma, which is a kind of a sexual trauma too. And I've been wondering, and I suppose there are specialists who have been working on the books who would come with this at a certain point in their analysis, but I've been wondering if this sexual trauma is actually a metaphor for the political trauma and the social trauma lived in this last period of the Soviet occupation I was referring to. And I find that already by itself very interesting, and I would like perhaps to be able to relate to it more in depth. Also, another aspect which is important, and I think one should bear in mind, is that sex, be it sex as they describe it literally, or be it as a metaphor of this social and political context, is dealt in a very illish manner, in a not very healthy way, I would say. In Cuncina's we find it very mixed also with alcoholism, characters coming out, drinks being poured down all the time, and it relates very much to the kind of visualization of sexual activity that happens there and the relationships that come out of these encounters. In the case of Gavelis, it's not about alcohol, it's about how sex is seen in a very Kafkian term. And it's seen very much in terms of obsessive transformations of the body, where a person all of a sudden transforms into an insect or into a monster or into definite creatures. And this is something that I've been thinking quite a lot, how these two guys were so obsessed with this topic, but how they were dealing it in such a, I would say, unhealthy way, at least for nowadays standards. And there's another point that I would like to bring into account, which is also something that nowadays, I believe in Lithuania, just the same as for the Spanish state where I come from, it's the objectivation of women. Women become an object of desire in both books. Both books are written by males, and both books deal with women seen by males in a way that I think it would be quite impossible to write nowadays without being denounced as a sexist or a misogynist in some ways. Another level of analysis, which is actually the one that fascinates me the most in both books, is how the city is lived and how the city appears. The different locations, the history of the different locations, the meaning of the locations for the main characters of both novels, and how these locations also vary in space and time. We're speaking about locations that can be located, that take place in the historic center, or that can happen also in areas like the one we are now, which they are normally known as sleeping areas in your language. Actually, the location of the site where we are now, it's the area of Minties Gadve, and in a way I wanted to be able to have this talk here because it also brings us to interesting interesting portraits of the city, related also to relationships between people. So if I'm allowed, I'm just going to read just these first lines of this paragraph. Of course, Viva, or how would you call her, didn't show up again. I knew it was hopeless to search for her traces, but I checked anyway. Her documentation had vanished. No one knew where it had disappeared to. The number of the building of Mintier Street she had given for her address had never existed. So it relates to this area, it relates to the city, but it also relates to these stories that not only Gavelis brings in his novel, but actually Conchinas brings in too, which are always fading stories. These are stories between people that do not solidify within something more meaningful within time. They vanish. So as I was saying, there's all these commonalities between the books. There's differences in the style of writing. There's differences in how they deal with, even with the Soviet occupation. They both deal differently with those times. I think that Vilnius Pocket of Ričardas Gavelis brings in a much more historical rooted sense within the novel as compared to Tula. And both books I really liked them at the end of the day, although I was a bit distanced to them because of how the topics were dealt with. But if I've got to admit, I have felt more comfortable reading Tula from Jurgis Conchinas. More comfortable because it brings images of a marginal, peripheral side of Vilnius and of peoples, which is not something you really find in Vilnius Pocket of Ričardas Gavelis. So then again, there we have an academic preference of mine because it actually depicts very clearly certain social groups living in Vilnius, whereas this is not something I actually see with Vilnius Pocket. Are you happy with that? Yeah?